The notification sound from Maya's banking app cut through the morning silence like a blade. She was sitting in her cramped studio apartment in Denver, nursing her third cup of coffee and staring at rejection emails from graphic design firms, when her phone buzzed with an alert that would shatter everything she thought she knew about trust. Unusual account activity detected. $47,000 withdrawal pending authorization. Her hands trembled as she read the message again, certain there had to be some mistake. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Maya Chen had exactly $2,847 in her checking account. She knew this because she'd counted every dollar obsessively since losing her marketing job 3 months ago. The number $47,000 might as well have been $47 million for someone barely scraping together rent money through freelance logo designs and food delivery gigs. Her finger hovered over the bank's customer service number, her heart hammering against her ribs as a cold realization began to creep in. 3 weeks earlier, she had signed paperwork giving her Aunt Linda power of attorney over her finances. It was supposed to be temporary, just until she could get back on her feet after the layoffs at Morrison Associates had decimated their creative department. Linda had swooped in like a guardian angel, offering to help Maya navigate the bureaucratic maze of unemployment benefits, health insurance, and loan deferrals. Family takes care of family, Linda had said, her voice warm with concern as she spread the legal documents across Maya's kitchen table. Let me handle the boring stuff so you can focus on finding work. Maya's thumb pressed the call button with the weight of mounting dread. The automated voice system at First National Bank seemed designed to test human patience, cycling Maya through menu options that felt increasingly surreal as she tried to explain her situation. Press 1 for account balances. Press 2 for recent transactions. Press 3 if your trusted family member might be systematically destroying your financial future. When she finally reached a human representative, the woman's voice carried that particular mixture of professionalism and pity that bank employees reserve for fraud victims. Ms. Chen, I see the withdrawal request here. It was submitted yesterday evening using your online banking credentials and authorized with the power of attorney documentation on file. The funds are being transferred to Sunset Properties, LLC, for what's listed as an investment opportunity. The transaction is set to process this afternoon unless you contact us to dispute it. My studio apartment suddenly felt like it was tilting. Sunset Properties? She had never heard that name in her life. The power of attorney was supposed to help Linda pay Maya's bills and manage her unemployment benefits, not drain her account from mysterious real estate ventures. I need to stop this transaction immediately, Maya said, her voice sounding strange and distant. This wasn't authorized by me. The representative's keyboard clicked in the background. I'm placing a hold on the transfer now, but Ms. Chen, I need to inform you that this appears to be part of a larger pattern. Your account shows 3 previous withdrawals over the past 2 weeks, totaling $23,600. These were also authorized using your power of attorney documentation. Maya's studio apartment suddenly felt like it was tilting. Sunset Properties? She had never heard that name in her life. The power of attorney was supposed to help Linda pay Maya's bills and manage her unemployment benefits, not drain her account for mysterious real estate ventures. I need to stop this transaction immediately, Maya said, her voice sounding strange and distant. This wasn't authorized by me. The representative's keyboard clicked in the background. I'm placing a hold on the transfer now, but Ms. Chen, I need to inform you that this appears to be part of a larger pattern. Your account shows 3 previous withdrawals over the past 2 weeks, totaling $23,600. These were also authorized using your power of attorney.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
You're spending too much mental energy on financial logistics when you should be networking and building your portfolio. Let me handle the money stuff temporarily, just until you land something stable. The power of attorney paperwork had seemed like a natural progression. Linda's lawyer friend, David Brennan, had explained everything in soothing legal terminology. Temporary authorization, limited scope, easily revoked. Maya remembered feeling grateful, almost weepy with relief as she signed the documents. Finally, someone who understood her struggles and had the resources to help navigate them. Now, sitting in her studio with the bank representative explaining fraud protection procedures, Maya felt that gratitude curdling into something much darker. She ended the call and immediately dialed Linda's number, her hands shaking as she waited for her aunt to pick up. The phone rang once, twice, then went straight to voicemail. Linda's polished, professional greeting, the same one Maya had heard hundreds of times, suddenly sounded hollow and rehearsed. Maya tried Linda's office line next. The receptionist at Boulder Premium Properties answered with her usual chirpy enthusiasm. "I'm sorry, but Linda is out of town on business. She'll be back in the office Monday. Can I take a message?" Out of town? Maya felt ice forming in her stomach. Linda hadn't mentioned any business trips during their conversation 3 days ago. In fact, she had specifically confirmed plans for their usual Thursday coffee meeting, which was tomorrow. The next few hours passed in a blur of phone calls and mounting panic. Maya called David Brennan, the lawyer who had prepared the power of attorney documents, only to learn that his office had been closed for 2 weeks due to a family emergency. She tried Linda's personal cell phone every 15 minutes, each call rolling to the same voicemail message. She even drove to Linda's house in Boulder, a 40-minute trip that consumed most of her remaining gas money, only to find the place dark and empty, with mail piling up in the box. By evening, Maya was back in her apartment, surrounded by printouts of bank statements and legal documents, trying to piece together what had happened to her life. The 3 previous withdrawals that the bank representative had mentioned painted a devastating picture. The first, 2 weeks ago, was for $8,200 to something called Mountain Vista Investments. The second, a week later, was $7,800 to Brennan Legal Services. The third, just 3 days ago, was $7,600 to Alpine Credit Solutions. Maya had never heard of any of these companies. A desperate Google search revealed that Mountain Vista Investments and Alpine Credit Solutions had no online presence whatsoever. No websites, no business listings, nothing. Brennan Legal Services existed, but according to their website, they specialize in corporate mergers, not individual financial management. None of it made sense unless she accepted the possibility that had been growing like a tumor in her chest all day. Linda was stealing from her. The woman who had been Maya's role model, her safety net, her substitute parent during the worst years of her childhood, was systematically looting her bank account. The betrayal felt physical, like someone had reached into her chest and rearranged her organs. Maya found herself doubled over on her kitchen floor, gasping for air as the full implications washed over her. She was broke. Completely, utterly broke, with rent due in 6 days and no prospects for income beyond the occasional $20 logo design. Her unemployment benefits had been mysteriously delayed, something Linda had promised to handle through her lawyer friend. Now Maya wondered if there even were unemployment benefits, or if Linda had been intercepting those payments too. Maya's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Maya, this is David Brennan. Linda asked me to contact you about some irregularities with your power of attorney documentation. Can you meet me tomorrow at 2 p.m. at my office? Important we discuss this in person." Maya stared at the message, her exhausted brain trying to process this new development. David Brennan, whose office was supposedly closed? David Brennan, who had charged her almost $8,000 for services she hadn't authorized? She didn't respond to the text. Instead, she called the phone number back, but it went straight to a generic voicemail system. Something about the message felt wrong, too convenient, too perfectly timed with her discovery of the fraud. Maya was beginning to understand that she couldn't trust anyone in Linda's orbit, possibly including the lawyer who had seemed so helpful 3 weeks ago. That night, Maya barely slept. She lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to reconstruct the past 3 months, looking for signs she had missed. Linda's insistence on handling everything personally instead of teaching Maya how to manage the bureaucracy herself. The way she had discouraged Maya from looking too closely at the financial paperwork, brushing away questions with, "Don't worry about the details, sweetie. That's what I'm here for." The expensive dinners Linda insisted on paying for, claiming Maya needed to maintain professional appearances while job hunting. Had Linda been spending Maya's money on those dinners? On her own lifestyle? Maya remembered Linda's new designer handbag, the casual mention of a weekend trip to Aspen, the Range Rover upgrade she had attributed to a particularly lucrative real estate deal. How much of Linda's apparent success had been built on money stolen from her struggling niece? Maya's phone rang at 6:47 a.m., jarring her from the shallow doze she had finally fallen into. The caller ID showed her mother's number, which was unusual. Maya and her mother, Patricia, maintained a cordial but distant relationship, checking in every few weeks with carefully neutral conversations about weather and work. Patricia lived in Phoenix with her third husband and showed little interest in Maya's daily struggles. "Maya, honey, I just got the strangest call from Linda." Patricia's voice carried that particular tension Maya remembered from her parents' divorce proceedings 20 years earlier. "She says you're accusing her of some kind of financial impropriety. She sounded very upset, very concerned about your mental state." Maya felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest. Linda was already working damage control, reaching out to family members to establish her version of events before Maya could defend herself. It was a calculated move, the kind of strategic thinking that suggested this wasn't Linda's first time manipulating vulnerable relatives. "Mom, Linda has been stealing money from my bank account," Maya said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "She used the power of attorney I gave her to withdraw over $20,000 without my knowledge or consent. I discovered it yesterday when the bank called about another fraudulent transaction." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Maya wondered if the call had dropped. When Patricia finally spoke, her voice carried a mixture of disbelief and something that might have been disappointment. "Maya, Linda has been nothing but generous with you. She told me about the money she's been lending you, the job connections she's been making. Are you sure you're not confused about the arrangement you made with her?" Lending. Linda had told Patricia that Maya was borrowing money, not that Linda was managing Maya's existing funds. The lie was so smooth, so plausible, that Maya could almost admire its construction. Of course, Linda would present herself as the generous benefactor, rather than admit she was exploiting her niece's temporary vulnerability. "Mom, I'm not confused. I can show you the bank statements, the power of attorney documents, everything. Linda has been taking my money and using it for her own purposes. I need you to believe me." Patricia's sigh carried across the phone line like a weight. "Honey, I know you've been under a lot of stress with the job situation. Sometimes when we're overwhelmed, we can misinterpret things. Linda is family. She would never hurt you deliberately. Maybe there's been some miscommunication about the financial arrangements." Maya closed her eyes, feeling the familiar childhood sensation of being dismissed, of having her reality questioned by adults who were supposed to protect her. Even now, at 28, she was still the confused child whose perceptions couldn't be trusted. "I'm going to the police," she said quietly. "This is fraud, Mom. It doesn't matter that Linda is family." "Maya, please don't do anything rash. Let me call Linda and see if we can sort this out as a family. Going to the authorities would be devastating for her business reputation. Surely whatever happened can be resolved quietly." After Maya hung up, she sat in her kitchen drinking coffee that had gone cold hours ago and contemplating the isolation that seemed to be closing around her like floodwater. Linda had 24 hours to construct her narrative and reach out professional contacts. Maya had bank statements and a growing certainty that no one would believe her word against Linda's established reputation. But Maya also had something Linda might not have anticipated. She had learned, during her 3-month job search, how to research people and companies with the thoroughness of someone whose survival depended on gathering information. If Linda was running some kind of systematic fraud operation, there would be traces. digital footprints, business registrations, other victims who might not have spoken up yet. Maya opened her laptop and began searching for everything she could find about Sunset Properties LLC, Mountain Vista Investments, and Alpine Credit Solutions. What she discovered over the next several hours made her stomach churn with a mixture of fury and grudging admiration for Linda's sophisticated operation. Sunset Properties LLC had been registered in Nevada 6 months ago, with Linda Chen Martinez listed as the managing member. The business address was a mail forwarding service in Las Vegas. Mountain Vista Investments was registered in Delaware, also with Linda as the primary contact. Alpine Credit Solutions was the most interesting discovery. Registered in Wyoming and apparently designed to look like a legitimate debt consolidation service. Linda hadn't just been stealing from Maya. She had created an entire ecosystem of shell companies, probably designed to make fraudulent withdrawals look like legitimate business transactions. The power of attorney scam was sophisticated enough to suggest Linda had done this before, possibly multiple times with different victims. Maya spent the afternoon calling the Colorado Attorney General's office, the Better Business Bureau, and local law enforcement to understand her options for reporting financial fraud committed by a family member with legal authorization. The conversations were depressingly similar. Without clear evidence that Linda had exceeded the scope of the power of attorney, and given Linda's established business reputation, criminal charges would be difficult to pursue. "Your best bet is probably civil court," explained Detective Rodriguez from the Denver Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. "You'll need to document exactly how she violated the power of attorney agreement and quantify your damages. But I have to warn you, family financial disputes are complicated. Juries tend to be skeptical when relatives accuse each other of theft, especially when there's legal documentation involved." Maya was researching civil attorneys who specialized in financial fraud when her phone rang again. This time, the caller ID showed Linda's number. Maya's finger hovered over the decline button for a long moment before she decided she needed to hear what her aunt had to say for herself. "Maya, sweetheart, I just got off the phone with your mother. She says you're upset about some banking confusion." Linda's voice carried that same warm, concerned tone Maya had trusted for months. "I'm back from my business trip now. Why don't you come over for dinner tonight and we can sort this whole thing out? I think there might be some misunderstanding about the investments I've been making on your behalf." Investments. The word hung in the air between them like smoke. Linda was still trying to maintain the fiction that she had been acting in Maya's best interests, that the missing money represented legitimate financial planning rather than outright theft. "Linda, I know about Sunset Properties. I know about Mountain Vista Investments and Alpine Credit Solutions. I know you created those companies to steal my money from my account." Maya's voice was steady, almost calm, as she spoke the words that would permanently destroy their relationship. The silence stretched long enough that Maya wondered if Linda had hung up. When her aunt finally responded, the warmth had drained from her voice, replaced by something harder and more calculating. "Maya, I think you're confused about the nature of our arrangement. You signed documents giving me authority to make financial decisions on your behalf. Everything I've done has been completely legal and in your best interests. If you're having second thoughts about the investments, we can certainly discuss adjusting the strategy." "There were no investments, Linda. You stole my money and used it for your own purposes. I want every dollar returned to my account by the end of the week, or I'm filing criminal charges." Linda's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Oh, sweetie, you really don't understand how this works, do you? You signed legal documents. I have witnesses, including David Brennan, who will testify that you were fully informed about the investment strategy. Your mother has confirmed that you've been under a significant emotional stress lately. Who do you think a judge is going to believe? A successful businesswoman with 20 years in real estate, or an unemployed girl who's clearly having some kind of breakdown?" The threat was delivered with surgical precision, designed to make Maya understand exactly how isolated and powerless she was in this situation. Linda had spent months positioning herself as the reliable, generous family member while Maya struggled with unemployment and depression. She'd created a narrative that would be almost impossible for Maya to counter in court. But Maya had been underestimated her entire life. Growing up during her parents' bitter divorce, she had learned to document everything, to build cases with evidence rather than emotional appeals. Linda might have legal authorization for her theft, but she had also left digital trails that told a different story than the one she was trying to sell. "We'll see about that," Maya said quietly, and hung up. Over the next week, Maya threw herself into building a case against Linda with the same obsessive energy she had once devoted to job hunting. She contacted every business Linda's shell companies had interacted with, following money trails through business registration databases and corporate filings. She reached out to other Boulder real estate agents, carefully probing for information about Linda's recent financial situation and business practices. What she discovered was both worse and better than she had imagined. Linda's real estate business was struggling, had been struggling for over a year as the Boulder market shifted and competition intensified. Several agents mentioned that Linda had been taking on increasingly risky deals, representing clients in transactions that other agencies had declined. There were whispers about cash flow problems, missed commission payments, expensive personal spending that didn't align with her actual income. Maya also discovered that Linda had tried to obtain power of attorney over their elderly grandfather's finances 6 months earlier, an attempt that had been blocked by other family members who were suspicious of her motives. The pattern was becoming clear. Linda had been looking for vulnerable relatives to exploit, and Maya's job loss had made her the perfect target. But Maya also found something Linda probably hadn't expected her to discover. In her research into Alpine Credit Solutions, she had traced the company's registered address to a business park in Colorado Springs. When she called the property management office, she learned that Alpine had never actually leased space there. The address was fake, which meant the business registration contained fraudulent information. That single detail changed everything. Linda hadn't just exceeded her authority under the power of attorney, she had committed federal mail fraud by using false addresses in business registrations. Maya immediately contacted the FBI's white-collar crime division and was transferred to Agent Sarah Kim, who specialized in interstate financial fraud cases. "Ms. Chen, based on what you're describing, this sounds like a sophisticated operation that probably involves multiple victims," Agent Kim explained during their phone conversation. "The use of shell companies registered in multiple states with fraudulent addresses suggests someone with experience in financial crimes. We'd like to open an investigation." Maya felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. The federal investigation would take time, but it would also freeze Linda's access to the fraudulent accounts and potentially recover funds for Maya and any other victims. More importantly, it would shift the power dynamic completely. Linda's threats about credibility and legal authorization became irrelevant when federal agents were documenting interstate fraud. The confrontation came 2 days later, when Linda appeared at Maya's apartment unannounced. Maya looked through the peephole and saw her aunt standing in the hallway, no longer the polished businesswoman, but someone who looked harried and desperate. Maya opened the door but left the chain lock engaged, creating a narrow gap between them. "Maya, we need to talk. I know you've been making calls, asking questions about my business. You're going to cause problems for both of us if you keep this up." Linda's voice carried an edge of panic that Maya had never heard before. "The only problem is the money you stole from me, Linda. The FBI is very interested in your shell companies and their fake business addresses. Did you really think nobody would notice that Alpine Credit Solutions doesn't actually exist?" Linda's face went pale. "You called the FBI? Maya, you have no idea what you've done. This is going to destroy my business, my reputation, everything I've built. We're family. We should be able to work this out privately. You destroyed our family relationship when you decided to steal from me. I trusted you completely, and you used that trust to systematically rob me while I was at my most vulnerable. There's no coming back from that." Linda tried a different approach, her voice softening into something that approximated her old warmth. "Maya, I know you're hurt, and I understand why, but the money isn't gone, sweetie. It's invested in properties that are going to generate significant returns. Within 6 months, you'll have more money than you started with. I was trying to surprise you, to turn your emergency fund into something that could really change your life." The lie was so elaborate, so carefully constructed that Maya almost admired its audacity. Even now, facing federal investigation, Linda was still trying to manipulate the narrative, to convince Maya that the theft had been a misguided attempt to help, rather than a calculated betrayal. If that were true, you would have discussed it with me before moving my money. You would have shown me business plans, investment prospectuses, something to prove these opportunities existed. Instead, you created fake companies and used fraudulent business addresses. That's not investing, Linda. That's theft. Maya closed the door and activated the deadbolt, leaving Linda standing in the hallway. Through the door, she could hear her aunt's voice rising in desperation, making promises about returning the money, threatening legal action, appealing to family loyalty. Maya turned up her music and ignored the increasingly frantic knocking. The federal investigation moved faster than Maya had expected. Within 2 weeks, Agent Kim called to inform her that Linda had been arrested on charges of interstate fraud, money laundering, and identity theft. The investigation had uncovered 2 other victims, elderly clients from Linda's real estate business, who had also signed power of attorney documents and subsequently had their accounts drained through the same shell company network. "We've frozen all the accounts associated with the fraudulent businesses," Agent Kim explained. "We should be able to recover most of your funds, though it might take a few months to work through the legal process. Your aunt has hired a very expensive criminal defense attorney, which suggests she might have more money hidden somewhere." Maya felt a complex mixture of relief and sadness as she absorbed the news. Relief that her money might be recovered, that Linda would face consequences for her actions, that other victims would get justice, but also sadness for the relationship she had lost, the trust that had been shattered, the realization that someone she had loved and admired had been systematically exploiting her for months. The aftermath was messy and complicated, as family betrayals always are. Patricia called Maya repeatedly, alternating between apologizing for not believing her initially and pleading for Maya to somehow reduce Linda's legal consequences. Other relatives took sides, some supporting Maya's decision to involve law enforcement, others arguing that family disputes should be handled privately, regardless of the criminal behavior involved. Maya's grandfather, the one Linda had previously tried to exploit, surprised everyone by offering to loan Maya money to cover her expenses while the federal case worked through the courts. "I never trusted Linda's sudden interest in helping with my finances," he admitted during a phone call. "I should have warned you when she started hovering around after you lost your job." The money Linda had stolen was eventually recovered, along with additional funds that represented interest and penalties. Maya used the settlement to move to a better apartment, invest in professional development courses, and start her own graphic design studio. The business grew steadily, built on a foundation of hard-earned wisdom about trust, boundaries, and the difference between genuine support and manipulative exploitation. Linda was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution to all her victims. The real estate business she had built over 20 years collapsed during the investigation, her professional licenses were revoked, and her personal assets were liquidated to cover legal fees and victim compensation. The sophisticated fraud operation she had constructed to steal from vulnerable family members became the instrument of her own destruction. Maya never spoke to Linda again. She declined to participate in the family's attempts at reconciliation, ignored Linda's letters from prison, and politely but firmly rejected suggestions that she should forgive and forget for the sake of family unity. Some betrayals, Maya learned, are too fundamental to heal. Trust, once completely broken, cannot be rebuilt through apologies or time. But Maya also discovered something she hadn't expected in the aftermath of Linda's betrayal. The experience of being systematically deceived and exploited by someone she loved had taught her to recognize genuine support when it appeared. The friends who helped her research Linda's fraud scheme, the grandfather who offered financial assistance without conditions, the FBI agent who treated her case with respect and thoroughness, these relationships were built on transparency and mutual respect, rather than manipulation and control. 2 years after Linda's arrest, Agent Kim called to inform her that Linda had tried to run a similar power of attorney scam on another inmate's elderly mother, using contraband cell phone access to continue her fraudulent activities even from prison. Additional charges were filed, extending Linda's sentence and confirming Maya's decision to pursue criminal prosecution rather than private resolution. "Some people never learn," Agent Kim commented during the call. "Your aunt seems to view vulnerable people as opportunities rather than individuals deserving of respect and protection. Prison hasn't changed that fundamental aspect of her character." Maya hung up the phone and looked around her thriving design studio, at the walls covered with client work and industry awards, at the team of freelancers she had hired as the business grew. Linda's betrayal had nearly destroyed her financially and emotionally, but it had also forced her to develop resilience, independence, and discernment she might never have cultivated otherwise. The experience had cost her a relationship she had valued and trusted, but it had also freed her from the burden of seeking approval from someone whose love had always been conditional and self-serving. Maya had learned to trust herself, to verify rather than simply believe, to distinguish between authentic support and manipulative manipulation. She still kept the original power of attorney documents in her desk drawer, not as a reminder of betrayal, but as evidence of her own strength in surviving and overcoming it. Sometimes the people who hurt us most deeply also teach us the most valuable lessons about our own capacity for resilience and growth. Maya's story became a cautionary tale she shared with other young professionals facing family pressure to accept financial help they didn't fully understand. Trust is precious precisely because it can be so easily broken, and the people closest to us sometimes have the greatest capacity to cause lasting harm. But survival, recovery, and ultimately thriving in the aftermath of betrayal is always possible for those willing to fight for their own truth and worth. Maya's new design studio occupied the third floor of a converted warehouse in Denver's River North Arts District, a space that buzzed with creative energy and the constant hum of innovation. 18 months had passed since Linda's sentencing, and Maya had transformed her stolen funds recovery into something far more valuable than money, a thriving business built on authentic relationships and transparent practices. The irony wasn't lost on her that Linda's betrayal had inadvertently provided the capital for Maya's entrepreneurial dreams, though the path to success had been anything but straightforward. The studio employed 12 people now, a mix of graphic designers, web developers, and marketing specialists who had gravitated toward Maya's leadership style. Unlike the corporate hierarchy at Morrison Associates, where Maya had felt invisible and disposable, her own company operated on principles of radical transparency and mutual support. Every employee knew the company's financial position, participated in major decision-making processes, and received profit-sharing bonuses that reflected their contributions to collective success. Maya had learned, through bitter experience, that trust must be earned through consistent actions rather than assumed through familial obligations or professional credentials. Her hiring process involved extensive background checks, reference verifications, and probationary periods that allowed both parties to assess compatibility without pressure. Several potential employees had been turned away not for lack of skill, but for inconsistencies in their histories that reminded Maya too sharply of Linda's carefully constructed facade. The psychological scars from Linda's betrayal manifested in unexpected ways. Maya found herself compulsively checking bank statements, sometimes multiple times per day, despite having implemented elaborate financial safeguards that made fraud virtually impossible. She had distributed her recovered funds across multiple institutions, established automatic alerts for any transaction above $50, and maintained separate accounts for business operations, personal expenses, and emergency reserves. Trust remained elusive in personal relationships as well. Maya had ended a promising romantic relationship with David, a fellow entrepreneur she had met at a networking event, when she discovered he had been less than truthful about his previous business failures. The lies weren't malicious. David had simply omitted mentioning that his previous startup had collapsed due to poor financial management. But Maya's tolerance for deception had been permanently altered by her experience with Linda. "You're holding everyone to an impossible standard," her therapist, Dr. Jennifer Caldwell, had observed during one of their weekly sessions. "Complete honesty is admirable, but human beings are complex creatures who sometimes shade the truth for reasons that have nothing to do with exploitation or manipulation. You need to find ways to distinguish between harmful deception and ordinary human imperfection." Maya understood the logic intellectually, but her emotional responses remained hypervigilant. She had developed an almost supernatural ability to detect inconsistencies in people's stories, changes in body language that suggested discomfort with their own narratives, gaps between stated intentions and observable actions. The skill served her well in business negotiations and client relationships, but it made casual friendships and romantic connections feel like constant exercises in forensic analysis. The studio's success had attracted attention from larger agencies interested in acquisition or partnership deals. Maya received regular calls from corporate development executives promising lucrative buyout offers, strategic alliances, and opportunities for rapid expansion. Each conversation followed a similar pattern: initial flattery about her company's innovative approach, vague promises about resources and market access, and carefully worded suggestions that Maya needed external expertise to reach her full potential. The parallels to Linda's original approach were unmistakable. The same appeal to ambition, the same implications that Maya was somehow incomplete without their assistance, the same glossing over of specific terms and conditions. Maya had developed a standard response to these overtures: a polite request for detailed written proposals, financial disclosures, and references from other companies they had previously acquired or partnered with. Without exception, the follow-up conversations revealed terms heavily skewed toward the larger agencies, with Maya's company essentially becoming a subsidiary stripped of independence and creative control. "They want to buy your client list and your talent, then gradually phase out everything that makes your company unique," explained Marcus Rodriguez, a business attorney Maya had retained after carefully vetting his background and speaking with dozens of his previous clients. "These acquisition offers are designed to sound generous while actually transferring all the real value to the acquiring company. It's perfectly legal, but it's also essentially a sophisticated form of theft." Maya appreciated Marcus's direct communication style, his willingness to explain complex legal concepts in plain language, and his insistence on transparency about his own fees and potential conflicts of interest. Unlike David Brennan, Linda's lawyer who had facilitated the power of attorney fraud, Marcus provided detailed written summaries of every conversation, maintained meticulous records of all transactions, and encouraged Maya to seek second opinions on any significant decisions. The studio's growth trajectory remained steady but sustainable, prioritizing long-term relationships over rapid expansion. Maya had turned down several high-profile clients whose demands would have required compromising her company's values or overextending her team's capabilities. She preferred working with medium-sized businesses and nonprofit organizations whose missions aligned with her commitment to ethical practices and social responsibility. One particularly meaningful project involved developing a comprehensive rebranding campaign for a Denver-based organization that helped fraud victims navigate the complex aftermath of financial crimes. Maya donated her services to the cause, understanding intimately the confusion and isolation that accompanied discovering that trusted individuals had systematically exploited their victims' vulnerability. Working with the fraud victim advocacy group connected Maya with others who had experienced similar betrayals. She met elderly couples whose adult children had drained their retirement accounts, small business owners whose partners had embezzled company funds, and young professionals whose romantic partners had destroyed their credit scores through identity theft. The stories were heartbreakingly similar: initial trust, gradual manipulation, devastating discovery, and long recovery processes, complicated by legal systems that often struggled to address crimes committed by people with legitimate access to their victims' resources. The psychological damage is often worse than the financial loss, explained Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the advocacy group's lead counselor. When strangers commit fraud, victims can maintain their basic trust in human nature by categorizing the experience as an encounter with a criminal outlier. But when family members, romantic partners, or close friends commit these crimes, it fundamentally disrupts the victim's ability to trust their own judgment about people's character and motivations. Maya recognized her own experience reflected in Dr. Martinez's description. The money Linda had stolen had been recovered within months, but the emotional aftermath continued to influence Maya's relationships and decision-making processes years later. She had developed coping mechanisms that served her well professionally, but sometimes isolated her personally, creating barriers between herself and people who might have become genuine friends or romantic partners. The advocacy group meetings provided a safe space for Maya to process her ongoing struggles with trust and vulnerability. She learned that hypervigilance was a common response to betrayal trauma, that her compulsive financial monitoring represented normal adaptation to a legitimate threat she had experienced. Other group members shared similar behaviors, checking locks multiple times before leaving home, saving multiple copies of important documents, maintaining detailed records of conversations and agreements. You're not paranoid.
Martinez assured the group during one particularly intense session, "You're appropriately cautious based on real experiences with deception and exploitation. The challenge is learning to modulate that caution so it protects you without preventing you from forming meaningful connections with trustworthy people." Maya began experimenting with calculated vulnerability, gradually sharing more personal information with carefully selected friends and colleagues. She started dating again, approaching relationships with the same methodical care she applied to business partnerships: clear communication about expectations, consistent observation of actions versus words, and willingness to end connections that showed signs of manipulation or dishonesty. Her romantic life remained complicated by her heightened sensitivity to inconsistency and deception. Maya ended a relationship with Sarah, a marketing executive, when she discovered Sarah had been misrepresenting her role in previous successful campaigns. The lies were professionally motivated rather than personally malicious, but Maya found herself unable to separate Sarah's professional embellishments from her potential for personal betrayal. "I understand why you're cautious," Sarah had said during their breakup conversation, "but you're looking for perfection in a world where everyone has complicated histories and mixed motives. I'm not Linda. I'm not trying to steal from you or manipulate you. I just wanted to impress you with my career achievements, even if that meant stretching the truth about my actual contributions." Sarah's words haunted Maya for weeks afterward. She recognized the validity of the criticism, while also understanding that her standards for honesty had been calibrated by an extreme experience with betrayal. Finding balance between appropriate caution and excessive suspicion required constant recalibration, like tuning an instrument that had been damaged and repaired. Maya's relationship with her extended family remained fractured along predictable lines. Patricia continued advocating for reconciliation with Linda, sending regular updates about Linda's prison experience and rehabilitation programs. According to Patricia, Linda had found religion, completed vocational training in bookkeeping, and expressed genuine remorse for her actions. Maya listened politely to these reports while maintaining her position that some betrayals were irreparable regardless of subsequent apologies or behavioral changes. "She's still our family," Patricia argued during one of their quarterly phone calls. "She made terrible mistakes, but she's paying for them. Don't you think forgiveness is more important than holding grudges forever?" Maya had developed a standard response to these appeals. Forgiveness was an internal process that she was working through with professional help, but forgiveness didn't require restoration of a relationship or renewed trust. Linda could become a better person in prison without Maya needing to become part of that transformation. Personal healing and interpersonal reconciliation were separate processes that didn't necessarily depend on each other. The most surprising development in Maya's family relationships came through her grandfather, Thomas Chen, who had become an unexpected source of wisdom and support.
At 83, Thomas possessed a clear-eyed understanding of family dynamics that came from decades of observing Linda's manipulative patterns. He had been suspicious of Linda's sudden interest in financial assistance long before Maya's crisis, recognizing signs of predatory behavior that younger family members had missed or ignored. Linda was always charming when she wanted something, Thomas explained during one of their regular Sunday lunch meetings. Even as a child, she knew how to present herself as helpful while actually pursuing her own interests. Your grandmother used to worry that Linda would grow up to be the kind of person who viewed other people as resources to be managed, rather than individuals to be respected. Thomas's observations helped Maya understand that Linda's betrayal hadn't been an aberration or a response to temporary financial pressure. The fraud represented a culmination of lifelong patterns of manipulation and exploitation that had simply found their most sophisticated expression in the power of attorney scam. This understanding was both disturbing and liberating, confirming that Maya's decision to pursue criminal prosecution had been appropriate while also absolving her of responsibility for somehow causing or preventing Linda's criminal behavior. Maya's business continued expanding, requiring increasingly complex management structures and financial systems. She hired a chief financial officer, Elena Vasquez, whose background included forensic accounting experience with white-collar crime investigations. Elena's expertise proved invaluable, not just for managing the studio's growing revenues, but for implementing fraud prevention protocols that protected against both external threats and internal misconduct. Trust but verify, Elena advised when designing the company's financial oversight procedures. You can maintain positive relationships with employees and vendors while also implementing systems that make embezzlement or misappropriation practically impossible. Transparency and accountability aren't signs of distrust, they're foundations for sustainable trust. Elena's approach resonated with Maya's hard-won understanding that genuine security came from robust systems rather than blind faith in individual character. The studio implemented quarterly financial audits, segregated duties that prevented any single employee from controlling entire transaction processes, and transparent reporting that made financial irregularities immediately visible to multiple oversight parties. These systems created a work environment where employees felt protected rather than suspected, understanding that the protocols existed to maintain the company's integrity and their own professional reputations. The transparency also attracted clients who appreciated working with an organization that demonstrated measurable commitment to ethical business practices. Maya's personal financial management had evolved into an elaborate system of checks and balances that would have seemed excessive to someone who hadn't experienced systematic fraud. She maintained accounts at 4 different banks, used a financial advisor whose recommendations were verified by an independent second opinion, and employed a certified public accountant whose work was reviewed annually by a different accounting firm. The redundant oversight systems required additional time and expense, but they provided psychological peace of mind that proved invaluable for Maya's overall well-being. She slept better knowing that her financial security couldn't be compromised by a single point of failure or a single person's dishonesty. The systems also served as a practical demonstration to her employees and clients that security and transparency were core values rather than mere marketing slogans. Maya's romantic life gradually stabilized around relationships with people who understood and respected her need for transparency and consistency. She began dating Alex Chen, no relation despite the shared surname, a nonprofit administrator whose work with homeless services had given him similar insights into the importance of clear boundaries and honest communication. Alex's professional experience included managing volunteers and staff members who sometimes struggled with substance abuse, mental health issues, or criminal backgrounds. His work required him to balance compassion with accountability, maintaining supportive relationships while also protecting vulnerable clients from potential exploitation or harm.
This skill set translated well to understanding Maya's hypervigilance without taking it personally or trying to convince her to lower her defenses prematurely. "I don't need you to trust me completely right away," Alex told Maya during an early conversation about her past experiences with betrayal. "I need you to trust me incrementally, based on my actions over time. If I'm trustworthy, that will become obvious through consistency. If I'm not trustworthy, you'll figure that out too,
and you'll be better off knowing sooner rather than later. Alex's approach allowed their relationship to develop organically, without pressure for Maya to override her instincts or ignore inconsistencies for the sake of romantic optimism. He shared information about his past relationships, financial situation, and career challenges without being asked, understanding that transparency was a prerequisite for intimacy rather than an invasion of privacy. Their relationship progressed slowly but steadily over 18 months, with Maya gradually becoming comfortable with increasing levels of emotional and practical interdependence. Alex met her friends and colleagues, participated in studio events, and integrated naturally into her social and professional networks without trying to control or redirect her priorities. The contrast with her previous relationships was stark. David had been charming, but ultimately superficial, sharing carefully curated information designed to impress rather than inform. Sarah had been genuine, but defensive about scrutiny, treating Maya's questions as accusations rather than legitimate attempts to build understanding. Alex was forthcoming and consistent, providing information without being asked and welcoming questions as signs of Maya's engagement rather than suspicion. Maya's therapy sessions with Dr. Caldwell had evolved from crisis management to ongoing personal development, focusing on integrating the lessons from Linda's betrayal without allowing that experience to completely define her approach to relationships and opportunities. The work involved learning to distinguish between reasonable caution and paralyzing hypervigilance, developing skills for assessing trustworthiness without requiring perfection from potential partners and friends. Trauma changes us, Dr. Caldwell explained during one particularly insightful session. The goal isn't to return to your pre-trauma state of naive trust, but to develop sophisticated trust that incorporates what you've learned about deception and manipulation while still allowing for meaningful connections with worthy people. Maya had begun speaking publicly about her experience with financial fraud, participating in seminars for young professionals about recognizing and preventing exploitation by trusted individuals. Her presentations focused on practical strategies, maintaining independent financial accounts even within committed relationships, seeking second opinions on major financial decisions, and distinguishing between healthy assistance and manipulative control. The speaking engagements connected Maya with other fraud survivors who had transformed their traumatic experiences into advocacy and education work. She met lawyers who specialized in elder financial abuse cases, therapists who worked with betrayal trauma survivors, and law enforcement officials who investigated white-collar crimes targeting vulnerable populations. These connections expanded Maya's understanding of fraud as a systemic social problem rather than a series of isolated personal tragedies. Linda's crimes existed within a broader pattern of exploitation that targeted people during vulnerable life transitions, job loss, divorce, illness, aging, or other circumstances that temporarily reduce their ability to maintain normal defensive vigilance. Financial predators are opportunistic, explained Detective Maria Santos, a specialist in economic crimes against vulnerable adults. They identify people who are isolated, stressed, or dependent, then position themselves as helpers while gradually assuming control over their victims' resources and decision-making processes. The attorney of power scam your aunt used is particularly effective because it creates legal authorization for theft while maintaining the appearance of legitimate assistance. Detective Santos invited Maya to participate in training sessions for law enforcement officers learning to investigate financial crimes committed by family members and trusted individuals. Maya's perspective as a survivor helped officers understand the psychological dynamics that made these crimes particularly devastating and difficult to prosecute. Victims often feel responsible for their own exploitation, Maya explained to a group of detectives and prosecutors during one training session. They blame themselves for trusting the wrong person, for not recognizing warning signs, for signing documents they didn't fully understand. That self-blame can make them reluctant to cooperate with investigations or pursue prosecution even when they have strong cases. Maya's advocacy work provided a sense of purpose that transformed her traumatic experience into something meaningful and constructive. She couldn't undo Linda's betrayal or eliminate the lasting effects of that trauma, but she could help other victims feel less isolated and assist law enforcement in building stronger cases against financial predators. The studio's third anniversary celebration took place in the same warehouse space where Maya had started with a single desk and determination to rebuild her professional life. The party brought together clients, employees, family members, and friends who had supported Maya's journey from fraud victim to successful entrepreneur. The gathering represented a community built on authentic relationships and mutual respect, everything Linda's manipulation had attempted to undermine. Maya stood before the assembled group, looking around at faces that represented different chapters of her recovery and growth. Alex stood near the back, smiling encouragingly. Elena discussed financial projections with a potential new client. Dr. Caldwell had stopped by briefly to celebrate Maya's progress. Even Patricia had flown in from Phoenix, finally beginning to understand the difference between Maya's principled boundaries and simple grudge holding. 3 years ago, I thought my life was over, Maya began her impromptu speech. I'd lost my job, my savings had been stolen by someone I trusted completely, and I felt like I'd never be able to trust my own judgment again. I was wrong about that last part. The experience taught me to trust myself more, not less. It taught me the difference between blind faith and informed trust, between helpful support and manipulative control. Maya paused, gathering her thoughts as she considered how much to share about the ongoing effects of Linda's betrayal. I still check my bank statements obsessively. I still ask a lot of questions when people offer to help me. I still maintain backup plans and emergency funds that some people might consider excessive. Those aren't signs of paranoia or failure to heal. They're signs of wisdom earned through experience. The applause was warm and sustained, coming from people who understood that Maya's success wasn't just professional, but personal, representing her ability to transform trauma into strength and isolation into community. The celebration continued past midnight, with conversations flowing naturally between different groups of people who might never have met without Maya's business bringing them together. As the party wound down and guests began departing, Maya found herself standing alone in the studio's main workspace, surrounded by the evidence of everything she had built from the ashes of Linda's betrayal. The computers and design software, the client portfolios and creative awards, the employee photos and community recognition plaques, all of it represented choices to trust carefully selected people and opportunities while maintaining the wisdom that prevented exploitation. Alex approached quietly, understanding Maya's need for a moment of reflection before transitioning back to everyday life. "Proud of you," he said simply, wrapping an arm around her shoulders without demanding attention or conversation. Maya leaned into his presence, appreciating his ability to offer comfort without overwhelming her with analysis or advice. The relationship had taught her that trustworthy people didn't require constant validation or explanation of her protective instincts. They simply demonstrated reliability through consistent actions and allowed trust to develop naturally over time. Linda remained in federal prison, scheduled for release in 18 months, with 3 years of supervised probation following her sentence. Maya had received several letters over the past year, each one expressing remorse and requesting reconciliation. She had read the letters carefully, looking for signs of genuine transformation versus continued manipulation, and had concluded that Linda's appeals still focused more on her own needs than on the damage she had caused her victims. Maya had responded to none of the letters, maintaining the boundary she had established at the beginning of Linda's prosecution. Some family members continued pressuring her to reconsider, arguing that Linda had served her time and deserved a second chance. Maya listened politely to these arguments while maintaining her position that consequences and rehabilitation were separate issues from relationship restoration. The trauma of Linda's betrayal would always be part of Maya's history, influencing her approach to relationships and opportunities in ways both protective and limiting. But that influence had been integrated into a stronger, more sophisticated understanding of trust, boundaries, and authentic connection. Maya had learned to distinguish between people who earned access to her life and resources through consistent, trustworthy behavior, and people who demanded trust as a prerequisite for relationship. The studio continued growing, adding new services and expanding into markets that aligned with Maya's values and vision. Maya had turned down acquisition offers worth millions of dollars, preferring to maintain control over the company culture and client relationships that made the work meaningful. Success, she had learned, wasn't just about financial achievement, but about creating something sustainable that reflected her authentic values and priorities. Maya's story had become a case study in resilience, transformation, and the possibility of rebuilding after devastating betrayal. But it was also a story about the ongoing work of healing, the daily choices required to maintain healthy boundaries while remaining open to worthy connections, and the complex process of integrating traumatic experiences into a meaningful and productive life. Standing in her studio at the end of the anniversary celebration, Maya understood that her journey wasn't about returning to who she had been before Linda's betrayal. It was about becoming someone stronger, wiser, and more authentic. Someone who could protect herself and others while still participating fully in the trust and vulnerability that make life meaningful. The woman who had signed those power of attorney documents 3 years earlier had been naive but hopeful. The woman she had become was cautious but still capable of hope. And that evolution represented the true victory over Linda's attempt to destroy her faith in human connection and her own worth. The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late October, 5 years after Linda's initial arrest and 6 months before her scheduled release from federal prison. Maya discovered it wedged between marketing brochures and utility bills in her apartment mailbox, the official return address from the Federal Bureau of Prisons, instantly recognizable despite the years that had passed. Her hands remained steady as she opened the envelope, though her heart rate accelerated in the familiar pattern that accompanied any unexpected communication related to Linda's case.
The letter contained a formal notification that Linda Chen Martinez had been approved for early release under a federal rehabilitation program designed to reintegrate white-collar offenders into society through supervised community service and vocational training. The program required Linda to secure employment, maintain regular contact with a probation officer, and complete 200 hours of financial literacy education for underserved communities. Most significantly for Maya, the letter included a requirement that Linda attempt to make direct restitution contact with her victims before release, pending their consent to such communication. Maya set the letter on her kitchen counter and stared at it for several minutes, processing the implications of Linda's impending freedom and the choice she now faced about whether to engage with her aunt's rehabilitation process. The years had provided enough distance that the immediate rage and betrayal had cooled into something more manageable, but the fundamental breach of trust remained as irreparable as ever. Linda's time in prison had apparently included vocational training, psychological counseling, and participation in various rehabilitation programs. But Maya understood that institutional change didn't automatically translate into genuine transformation. The studio had relocated to a larger space in downtown Denver's business district, occupying 2 floors of a renovated office building that housed other creative agencies and professional services firms. Maya employed 23 people now, including specialists in digital marketing, brand strategy, and multimedia production. The company had evolved beyond traditional graphic design to become a full-service creative consultancy that helped organizations develop authentic brand identities and communication strategies. Maya's personal life had achieved a stability that would have seemed impossible during the chaotic aftermath of Linda's betrayal.
Her relationship with Alex had progressed to cohabitation and shared financial planning, though they maintained separate primary accounts and decision-making autonomy in deference to Maya's hard-won understanding of financial independence. Their apartment featured a home office where Maya worked on client projects and advocacy writing, a space that represented the integration of her professional success with her personal mission of helping other fraud survivors. The timing of Linda's early release notification coincided with Maya's preparation for a major speaking engagement at a national conference on financial crimes against vulnerable populations. Her presentation would address long-term recovery strategies for betrayal trauma survivors, drawing on her 5-year journey from victim to advocate to successful entrepreneur. The irony of receiving Linda's release notification while preparing to discuss recovery from Linda's crimes wasn't lost on Maya, though she had learned to appreciate such synchronicities as opportunities for reflection rather than sources of distress. Maya's relationship with her extended family had evolved into something more honest and sustainable over the years. Patricia had gradually come to understand that Maya's refusal to reconcile with Linda wasn't about vindictiveness or inability to forgive, but about recognition that some relationships couldn't be safely restored regardless of apologies or behavioral changes. The shift in Patricia's perspective had occurred slowly, through conversations with Dr. Caldwell during family therapy sessions and through Patricia's own research into psychological trauma and recovery processes. "I used to think forgiveness meant going back to the way things were before," Patricia had explained during a recent visit to Denver. "But I understand now that forgiveness is an internal process that doesn't require putting yourself back in situations where you could be hurt again. You've forgiven Linda in the sense that you're not consumed by anger or revenge fantasies, but that doesn't mean you need to trust her again or welcome her back into your life."
They spoke weekly now, sharing updates about work, relationships, and daily life, without the underlying tension that had characterized their interactions for years after Linda's arrest. Patricia had even begun referring clients from her Phoenix real estate practice to Maya's studio, having finally recognized that Maya's business success wasn't an accident or a lucky break, but the result of genuine skill and determination. Maya's grandfather Thomas had become increasingly frail over the past year, requiring assistance with daily activities and medical appointments. Maya visited him twice monthly, often bringing Alex along for conversations that ranged from family history to business strategy to philosophical discussions about trust, betrayal, and human nature. Thomas possessed a perspective on Linda's criminal behavior that came from decades of observation, having watched her manipulative patterns develop from childhood through adulthood. Linda was always testing boundaries, Thomas had told Maya during a recent visit. Even as a little girl, she would see how much she could get away with before someone stopped her. Most children do that as part of normal development, but Linda never seemed to internalize the lessons about where appropriate behavior ended and exploitation began. She just got better at hiding her manipulations and finding people who wouldn't set firm boundaries. Thomas's observations helped Maya understand that Linda's prison rehabilitation, however genuine, couldn't address personality patterns that had been established over decades of practice. Linda might have learned new coping strategies and received psychological treatment, but the fundamental character traits that enabled her to systematically exploit vulnerable family members weren't likely to disappear through institutional programming alone. The federal probation officer assigned to Linda's case, Agent Jennifer Walsh, contacted Maya directly to discuss the restitution communication requirement. Agent Walsh explained that the early release program included provisions designed to help offenders understand the full impact of their crimes on victims, but participation was entirely voluntary for the victims themselves. Maya could decline contact without affecting Linda's release status, or she could choose to participate in supervised communication that would be documented as part of Linda's rehabilitation file. The purpose isn't reconciliation, Agent Walsh clarified during their phone conversation. It's accountability. Some victims find it helpful to have the opportunity to express directly how the crime affected them, while others prefer to maintain their distance. There's no right or wrong choice, and your decision won't influence whether Miss Chen Martinez is released or how her probation is structured.
Maya requested time to consider the option, understanding that her choice would have implications beyond her own emotional well-being. Her participation might provide valuable information for Agent Walsh's assessment of Linda's rehabilitation progress, potentially protecting future victims if Linda's expressions of remorse proved to be manipulative rather than genuine. Alternatively, engaging with Linda might reopen psychological wounds that had healed sufficiently to allow Maya to move forward with her life and relationships. Maya discussed the decision with Dr. Caldwell during their monthly therapy sessions, which had transitioned from weekly crisis management to periodic check-ins, focused on maintaining psychological health and continued personal growth. Dr. Caldwell had guided Maya through the initial trauma response, the difficult process of rebuilding trust in relationships, and the ongoing work of integrating betrayal experiences into a coherent life narrative. The question isn't whether Linda deserves your forgiveness or participation in her rehabilitation. The question is whether engaging with her serves your own healing process and personal goals. You've already demonstrated remarkable resilience and growth. You've built a successful business, maintained healthy relationships, and transformed your traumatic experience into meaningful advocacy work. Contact with Linda might provide closure, or it might simply reopen old wounds without adding value to your life. Dr. Caldwell encouraged Maya to consider her motivations for potential engagement carefully, distinguishing between genuine curiosity about Linda's transformation and residual feelings of responsibility for Linda's rehabilitation. Maya had worked hard to understand that she bore no responsibility for Linda's criminal choices or for helping Linda become a better person. Her own healing didn't require Linda's redemption, and Linda's redemption didn't require Maya's participation or approval. Maya's advocacy work had expanded to include collaboration with federal law enforcement agencies, developing training programs for investigating financial crimes within families and intimate relationships. Her experience provided insight into victim psychology that helped agents understand why these cases were often difficult to prosecute successfully. Victims frequently minimized the crimes, accepted partial responsibility for their own exploitation, or prioritized family unity over criminal justice outcomes. Financial abuse within families is particularly insidious because it exploits natural trust and dependency relationships, Maya explained during a training session for federal prosecutors. Victims often struggle to recognize that they've been deliberately targeted and systematically exploited. They blame themselves for being naive or trusting, rather than understanding that they were manipulated by someone who understood exactly how to exploit their vulnerabilities. Maya's presentations had become increasingly sophisticated over the years, incorporating research from psychology, criminology, and family systems theory. She had co-authored several articles for professional journals about long-term recovery from betrayal trauma and had been invited to serve on advisory boards for nonprofit organizations focused on fraud prevention and victim services. The professional recognition felt meaningful, but Maya's greatest satisfaction came from individual connections with fraud survivors who reached out after her presentations. She received regular emails from people who had experienced similar betrayals, sharing their stories and asking for advice about recovery strategies. Maya responded to each message personally, understanding that isolation was one of the most damaging aspects of betrayal trauma, and that connection with others who had survived similar experiences could be profoundly healing. One particularly moving correspondence had developed with Rebecca Martinez, a woman in her 40s whose husband had systematically drained their joint retirement accounts to fund a gambling addiction he had concealed for years. Rebecca's situation differed from Maya's in many details, but the underlying dynamics of trust, deception, and recovery were remarkably similar. Their email exchanges had evolved into regular phone conversations and eventually an in-person friendship when Rebecca relocated to Denver for work. Reading about your experience gave me permission to protect myself. I felt so guilty about not trusting my husband anymore, even after he went through treatment for gambling addiction. But you helped me understand that trust has to be earned back through consistent actions over time, not just granted because someone says they're sorry and they've changed. Rebecca's recovery process included many of the same elements Maya had navigated: establishing independent financial accounts, developing support systems outside the primary relationship, and learning to distinguish between appropriate caution and paralyzing hypervigilance.
The friendship provided Maya with perspective on her own healing journey, while offering Rebecca practical guidance based on lived experience rather than theoretical knowledge. Maya's relationship with Alex had deepened into a partnership characterized by mutual respect, transparent communication, and shared commitment to each other's individual growth. They had purchased a house together in a Denver neighborhood known for its artistic community and environmental sustainability, though they maintained separate ownership structures that protected both parties' financial independence. The arrangement reflected Maya's ongoing need for security and autonomy, while allowing for increasing interdependence and shared planning. Alex had proposed marriage 6 months earlier, presenting Maya with a vintage ring and a carefully considered speech about wanting to formalize their commitment while respecting her boundaries about financial and legal entanglements. They had decided to proceed with a small ceremony focused on celebrating their relationship rather than creating complex legal and financial obligations. The wedding planning process had provided opportunities for Maya to practice trust and collaboration while maintaining the protective strategies that had become integral to her sense of safety. Marriage doesn't have to mean losing your individual identity or financial independence, Alex had assured her during their discussions about prenuptial agreements and asset protection. I want to build something together that makes both our lives better, not create a situation where either of us becomes vulnerable to exploitation or control. Alex's understanding of Maya's perspective came partly from his own professional experience working with vulnerable populations, and partly from his genuine commitment to Maya's well-being and autonomy. He had never pressured her to trust him more quickly or completely than felt comfortable, understanding that trust was earned through consistency over time, rather than demanded as a prerequisite for a relationship. The wedding had taken place in their backyard, surrounded by friends, colleagues, and family members who had supported their individual and collective growth. Patricia had flown in from Phoenix, bringing Maya's stepfather, and expressing genuine happiness about Maya's relationship choice. Thomas had attended despite his increasing health challenges, offering a toast that celebrated Maya's resilience and Alex's patience in earning her trust through years of consistent behavior. Maya has taught all of us about the difference between blind trust and informed trust, Thomas had said during his wedding speech. She's shown us that it's possible to remain open to love and connection even after experiencing profound betrayal. Alex has shown us what it looks like to earn trust through actions rather than demand it through words. The ceremony had been deliberately small and intimate, reflecting Maya's preference for meaningful connections over social obligations. Dr. Caldwell had attended, as had several clients who had become friends over the years. Elena, Maya's chief financial officer, had served as maid of honor, representing the professional family Maya had built through careful hiring and authentic leadership. Marcus Rodriguez, Maya's attorney, had offered legal counsel about the prenuptial agreement that protected both spouses' assets while allowing for shared financial planning and decision-making. Maya's decision about whether to participate in Linda's restitution communication process ultimately came down to a simple question: would engagement serve her own continued growth and healing, or would it primarily serve Linda's rehabilitation needs at Maya's emotional expense? After weeks of consideration and consultation with Dr. Caldwell, Alex, and several trusted friends, Maya concluded that she had no interest in helping Linda process her guilt or demonstrate her rehabilitation to prison officials. Maya drafted a formal response to Agent Walsh declining participation in the restitution communication program. The letter was brief and professional, explaining that Maya had achieved sufficient closure and healing through other means and preferred to maintain her distance from Linda's rehabilitation process. She wished Linda success in her reintegration efforts, while making clear that success would need to be achieved without Maya's involvement or validation. I've spent 5 years building a life that isn't defined by Linda's crimes or dependent on Linda's redemption, Maya explained to Agent Walsh during a follow-up phone call. Engaging with her now would serve her needs rather than mine, and I've learned to prioritize my own well-being over other people's expectations or rehabilitation requirements.
Agent Walsh expressed understanding and appreciation for Maya's clarity about her boundaries and needs. The conversation provided Maya with information about Linda's release timeline and conditions, including a requirement that Linda maintain at least 100 miles distance from Maya's residence and workplace, unless specifically authorized by the probation office. The geographical restriction felt unnecessary given Maya's lack of interest in contact, but she appreciated the additional layer of protection it provided. Linda's release occurred on a Thursday morning in February, an event Maya learned about through a brief notification from Agent Walsh confirming that Linda had been transferred to a halfway house in Colorado Springs and had begun her community service requirements. Maya felt no particular emotional response to the news, recognizing that Linda's freedom or confinement had become irrelevant to her daily life and long-term well-being. Maya marked the occasion by writing in the journal she had maintained throughout her recovery process, reflecting on the transformation that had occurred over the past 5 years. The woman who had discovered Linda's theft had been financially devastated, emotionally shattered, and profoundly isolated. The woman writing in the journal 5 years later was financially secure, emotionally stable, surrounded by authentic relationships, and professionally fulfilled through meaningful work. Linda's crimes cost me money, trust, and peace of mind, Maya wrote in her journal. But they also forced me to develop strength, wisdom, and discernment I might never have cultivated otherwise. I wouldn't choose to experience betrayal again, but I can acknowledge that surviving it has made me more capable of recognizing and building authentic relationships based on mutual respect and consistent trustworthy behavior. The studio continued thriving under Maya's leadership, attracting clients who appreciated working with an organization that demonstrated genuine commitment to ethical business practices and social responsibility. Maya had established a scholarship program for young designers from underserved communities, funded through a percentage of the company's annual profits. The program reflected her understanding that success carried obligations to help others access similar opportunities for growth and achievement. Her advocacy work had expanded to include testimony before congressional committees considering legislation to strengthen protections for vulnerable adults against financial exploitation. Her expertise had been recognized through appointments to advisory boards for federal agencies developing fraud prevention programs and victim services protocols. The work felt meaningful, not just because it might prevent others from experiencing similar betrayals, but because it represented Maya's transformation from victim to expert, from someone seeking help to someone capable of providing help to others. The 5-year anniversary of Linda's arrest passed without fanfare or particular reflection, having become simply one date among many in Maya's complex personal history rather than a defining traumatic milestone. Maya was preparing for a major client presentation when the date occurred to her, noting it briefly in her calendar before returning attention to the creative work that had become central to her professional identity and personal satisfaction. Maya's relationship with Alex had settled into comfortable routines that balanced togetherness with individual autonomy, shared goals with personal pursuits, and emotional intimacy with practical independence. They traveled together regularly, exploring national parks and international destinations that offered opportunities for adventure and cultural enrichment. Alex had learned to appreciate Maya's preference for detailed planning and backup contingencies, understanding that her need for control over logistics reflected hard-won wisdom about protecting herself from unnecessary vulnerabilities. Their home had become a gathering place for friends and colleagues who appreciated the warmth and authenticity that characterized Maya and Alex's hospitality. Dinner parties featured conversations that ranged from business strategy to social justice issues to personal growth challenges, reflecting the diverse community Maya had assembled through careful relationship building over the years.
Dr. Caldwell had transitioned from Maya's therapist to a professional colleague and personal friend, co-authoring articles about betrayal trauma recovery and collaborating on training programs for mental health professionals working with fraud victims. Their relationship represented Maya's ability to transform healing relationships into ongoing connections based on mutual respect and shared professional interests. You've become someone who helps others heal from similar traumas, Dr. Caldwell observed during one of their quarterly check-in sessions. That transformation represents the most powerful form of recovery, where your painful experiences become sources of wisdom and assistance for others facing similar challenges. Maya's extended family relationships had stabilized around clear boundaries and realistic expectations,
rather than idealized notions of unconditional familial loyalty. Patricia visited twice yearly, maintaining a warm but respectful relationship that acknowledged Maya's autonomy and decision-making authority. Thomas's health had continued declining, but he remained engaged with Maya's life and proud of her achievements, often telling friends and caregivers about his granddaughter's successful business and advocacy work. Maya received periodic updates about Linda's progress through the federal probation system, learning that Linda had secured employment with a nonprofit organization providing financial literacy education to low-income families. The irony of Linda teaching financial responsibility to vulnerable populations wasn't lost on Maya, though she felt no particular interest in Linda's professional activities or personal development. Linda's rehabilitation had become someone else's concern and responsibility, no longer connected to Maya's healing or well-being. The studio's success had attracted acquisition interest from several larger agencies, but Maya had learned to evaluate such opportunities through the lens of her values and long-term goals rather than short-term financial incentives. She had turned down offers that would have provided immediate wealth, but required compromising the company culture and client relationships that made the work meaningful. Instead, Maya had chosen sustainable growth that allowed her to maintain control over the organization's direction and values. Maya's speaking engagements had evolved into a second career focused on fraud prevention, victim advocacy, and organizational ethics. She delivered keynote presentations at conferences for law enforcement professionals, mental health practitioners, and business leaders, sharing insights about recognizing and preventing financial exploitation while building resilient systems and relationships. The presentations always included practical strategies for identifying manipulation and establishing protective boundaries, but Maya's most powerful message concerned the possibility of transformation and growth following betrayal. Audiences responded particularly strongly to her emphasis that recovery wasn't about returning to previous levels of trust and vulnerability, but about developing more sophisticated approaches to relationships and risk management. Trauma changes us, Maya would tell her audiences. The goal isn't to become who we were before the traumatic experience, but to integrate what we've learned into a stronger, wiser version of ourselves. Betrayal taught me the difference between earned trust and assumed trust, between healthy assistance and manipulative control, between authentic relationships and sophisticated exploitation. Maya's story had become a case study in multiple academic and professional contexts, referenced in research about financial crime recovery, family systems therapy, and post-traumatic growth. She had been interviewed for documentary films about white-collar crime and had contributed chapters to books about fraud prevention and victim services. The attention felt meaningful because it amplified her message that recovery was possible and that traumatic experiences could become sources of wisdom and strength for others facing similar challenges. But Maya's greatest satisfaction came from the individual connections with fraud survivors who reached out after hearing her speak or reading her articles. The emails and letters continued arriving regularly, sharing stories of betrayal and recovery that reminded Maya why her advocacy work mattered. Each person who found hope or practical guidance through her presentations represented a small victory against the isolation and shame that made financial exploitation so devastating. Maya had learned to view Linda's betrayal as one chapter in a larger story about resilience, growth, and the possibility of transforming pain into purpose. The experience had cost her money, trust, and peace of mind, but it had also provided opportunities for development that might never have occurred otherwise. She had built a successful business, maintained authentic relationships, and created meaningful work that helped others navigate similar challenges. Standing in her studio's conference room 5 years after Linda's release from prison, Maya looked around at the team she had assembled through careful hiring and authentic leadership. The walls displayed awards for creative excellence and community service, client testimonials that praised both the quality of the work and the integrity of the business practices, and photos from company events that captured the genuine relationships that made the daily work meaningful. Maya had received word that morning that Linda had completed her probation requirements successfully and was no longer under federal supervision. The news felt anticlimactic, simply confirming that Linda's legal obligations had been fulfilled without requiring any response or emotional processing from Maya.
Linda's freedom and rehabilitation had become irrelevant to Maya's continued growth and well-being, representing the ultimate success of Maya's recovery process. Alex appeared in the conference room doorway, reminding Maya about their dinner reservation and weekend travel plans. Their relationship had become a source of daily joy and support, characterized by the kind of trust that develops slowly through consistent, trustworthy behavior over time. Maya had learned to distinguish between people who demanded trust as a prerequisite for relationship and people who earned trust through reliable actions and transparent communication. Maya's phone buzzed with a text message from a conference organizer confirming her keynote presentation for the following month's National Fraud Prevention Summit. The presentation would address long-term recovery strategies and the possibility of post-traumatic growth following financial betrayal. Maya's message to the audience would be the same message she had learned to tell herself. Betrayal might change us permanently, but it doesn't have to define us permanently. The story that had begun with a devastating phone call about fraudulent bank withdrawals had become a story about resilience, authentic relationships, and the transformation of traumatic experiences into wisdom and purpose. Maya had learned that recovery wasn't about forgetting or forgiving, but about integrating difficult experiences into a coherent life narrative that included both vulnerability and strength, both appropriate caution and openness to worthy connections. Maya locked the studio's front door and walked toward the parking garage where Alex was waiting, ready to transition from the professional identity she had built through years of careful work to the personal identity she had cultivated through equally careful relationship building. The woman walking to meet her husband bore little resemblance to the devastated fraud victim who had discovered Linda's betrayal 6 years earlier, but she carried the wisdom earned through surviving that experience and transforming it into something meaningful and productive. The evening stretched ahead with dinner reservations, weekend travel plans, and the comfortable routines of a life built on authentic foundations rather than assumed obligations or inherited relationships. Maya had learned to construct her world deliberately, surrounding herself with people and opportunities that reflected her values and supported her continued growth. Linda's betrayal had forced that reconstruction, but Maya had chosen to build something stronger and more sustainable than what had been destroyed.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.